Hello and welcome to this Royal Society video podcast. We spend a third of our lives asleep, but understanding what is happening in the brain as we sleep continues to puzzle scientists. In this special issue of Philosophical Transactions A, leading researchers have combined forces and are revealing new insights into how the mind works. I'm joined by Thomas Wennekers, reader in computational neuroscience at the University of Plymouth, and one of the editors of this issue to understand more. This research uses a discipline called complexity science. Can you explain to us what that is?
A science of complex things that are in some way complex. There's not really a definition of what it is, but there's the common idea that complex systems deal with a system that consists of many things and their interactions. An example would be the internet. If you really look at it physically, then you have computers, and the computers are connected by cables or wirelessly. That's physical interactions, and they exchange information, which is a functional aspect. But the connectivity structure, which is not a simple one, which is complex in a way, is an aspect of complexity science. But maybe another example is a swarm of birds. These are also physical entities. They do interact if they fly around. They see each other. They see a couple of their neighboring birds, and they flock together. They dissolve in a dynamic way. That's also an aspect of complexity science.
What is it about the brain that allows you to apply complexity science to it?
Well, there are these two aspects, the anatomical aspect and the functional aspect, and they both apply to the brain. On the anatomical side, the brain consists of, it's a modular system that consists of units on different scales. The units and the different scales are not always easy to define, but you can look at the brain as a whole, and then it consists of different parts like the brainstem, the midbrain, the forebrain, and the different parts, especially in the most modern part, the neocortex, are further subdivided into different areas that deal with different things, and the areas again are subdivided in some smaller units which are more difficult to define, and some have called them assemblies, some speak about microcolumns. So there are different attempts to define a finer scale there of elementary units. And even finer scale one has individual neurons, and all these units, all these different levels have some kind of units, and the units are connected with each other physically by nerves and synapses, and so they can speak to each other. It's not a simple network, it's a complex network that even has hierarchies. On the level of anatomy, complexity science, the brain is an ideal object of complex network science, if you want. And on the functional level as well, if you do something, if you think something, if you speak, whatever you do, there's always a certain subpart of the neurons engaged, and but that changes depending on the task. So it's a little bit like the birds, and so that's where the functional aspect comes into play. And so both aspects are ideal candidates for a complexity science researcher to look at them.
This issue looks at the sleeping brain. Why does it have to be sleeping? Well,
probably the shortest answer is simplicity. The awake brain is too complicated. If one wants to study the awake brain, then one has to study all the psychology and whatever is going on, all the physiology and so on. But the sleeping brain is simpler, and there are also certain aspects that are appealing for physicists and complexity scientists, and that is that there are different sleep stages, and in these different stages there are different physical mechanisms playing, and there are also different functional networks that get engaged, and that can be a good test bed for complexity science again.
This issue is a compilation of the latest sleep and complexity research. What can we expect to find in this issue?
No, we have actually different types of articles. So there are more review style articles and more research papers, and we have also articles from different areas like complexity science, but also experimental sciences and mathematics data analysis. And beside that, we have articles about that address conceptual questions, like what complexity science is and how it may relate to the brain, to physically, but also functionally. And there is an experimental article that considers complex networks in NREM sleep, in the deeper kind of sleep, and they look at network connectivity on a global scale there, taking real data. There are, if one really wants to measure these phenomena, given EEG or fMRI, there are technical problems. So there are also some articles that deal with source localization, so which is a method to derive where electrical signals recording from the scalp come, where precisely in the brain, and that would be obviously necessary if one wants to record networks, activated functional networks in the brain.
Can you explain what fMRI and EEG are?
In EEG, you usually wear a cap with electrodes at well-defined locations, and the electrodes pick up very weak electrical signals that are caused by neurons that are close to the electrodes. So EEG is one of these non-invasive techniques, and then there's also a functional magnetic resonance imaging, which uses completely different physical processes, and but has a higher spatial resolution. The temporal resolution is much lower, but the spatial resolution is much higher, and that means one can look into the brain and record the brain activity on a temporal scale of maybe a second, or probably better already.
What challenges do you face when studying the brain as a complex system?
One is the definition of units. If one really looks at the complexity science level, there are some units which are quite easily figured out, like the individual neurons, but the neurons as such are probably not really the right level to look at functional properties of the brain. And the functional properties I ultimately mean cognitive properties. So one also has to look at circuits and levels in between, and there is where it becomes more complicated immediately. And data analysis is another point, which is again complexity science, the data analysis side of complexity science. If you record from the brain, you can do it with single electrodes, but meanwhile there are setups with many more electrodes where you can derive brain activity on a pretty large scale too. It still only is a tiny fraction of all the neurons in the brain, but you get very high dimensional data, and then you have a problem how to analyze it, and ideas from complexity science can help with that. And that doesn't only apply to recordings on the single unit level, it also applies to EEG data, in which case it's just a different unit that you record. It's more like populations of cells at a certain resolution.
This type of research is still relatively new. What can we expect to find out in the future?
I think the large-scale and multi-scale approaches to simulation, the simulation approach to brain model is a big challenge, and one that is very promising. There are quite a big number of groups now working on implementing brains on computer clusters, and some people even build new hardware to simulate brains, special purpose hardware to simulate brains. And that is definitely something that will drive researchers in the field for the next 10 years, and but at least 10 years. But in 10 years, I think we will have models that do reflect brain function in a realistic way. It will not really be the brain or an exact copy of the brain, and it will also not be as smart as our brains. That's very unlikely, but it will reflect various kinds of cognitive processes. It can simulate the wake-sleep cycle, these different rhythms, waves, and so on. I also think it sooner or later maybe sooner than later, one can do models of dreaming, so one could have a model. There are, at the moment, ideas, of course, of what dreaming is and how it comes up, but there haven't been any models in a computational sense so far. But if one has a large-scale simulation, as I've been speaking about, one could do that. One could build a system that dreams. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, in the end, we want to wake up, of course. So far, that special issue is about sleep research, but because sleep research has a certain aspect which make the research simple and doable. But the ultimate goal is to understand what the brain does during its wake state too. So we don't only want to work on sleep, we also want to wake up and then look at all the other things that are there to do.